Alaska has been called the final frontier. Located thousands of miles away from the original colonies of the United States, and still over 1,000 miles away from the continental US. It, along with Hawaii, are two of the 7 external territories of the United States. Yet only these two are equal in terms of the rest of the states, with the right to vote in the presidential election and have representatives in the US House and Senate. While Alaska has had a rather recent history with the US, what may be interesting to learn is that it was colonized by a European power before the United States was even an independent country. What was the power, you may ask? In this video, we will be looking at the Russian colonization of Alaska. No, not like that. Since the Russian independence in the 15th century, land to the east was seen by many as a mythical place, homeland of the horse nomad, home to a secret power that great empires held, and fur. Don't forget about the fur. Russian colonization of Siberia was a centuries-long endeavor, and one that would catapult the state to have a massive stretch of territory, even though limited populations existed the further east they claimed. The last major expedition of this kind was that of Seymon Desniev back in 1648. Desniev managed to sail around the eastern cape of Siberia, sail into the Bering Strait, and go up the Androy River to found an outpost. A land bridge between Siberia and the Americas had been believed to have existed, and while Desniev was likely very unaware of what was discovered, he proved that no such land bridge existed, and was the first recorded individual to have sailed through the Bering Strait. However, the debate still raged as to whether or not a land bridge did exist, as his discovery was not relayed to the Russian government. It wouldn't be until late 1724 when Tsar Peter the Great once again called for expeditions. Early next year was the first Comanche expedition headed by Vitus Bering. This expedition was set out to confirm if a strait existed between Asia and North America. This he managed to accomplish, and it proved useful insights into the geography of eastern Siberia. In total, the expedition surveyed more than 3,500 kilometers of the sea, which was later named after Bering. Its map of the area was later used by all Western European cartographers. But Bering's work was not yet done. In 1733, Peter once again called upon his services, funding what would be known as the Great Northern Expedition, one of the largest expeditions within all of history. The expedition had a few goals, one being to find and map eastern Siberia, attempt to find a northern sea route from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and, if possible, explore the western shores of Northern America. All total, over 3,000 individuals were involved in this expedition, and it cost the Russian state 1.5 million rubles, which was 1/6 of its annual budget at the time. That would very roughly translate to around $500 million US in modern currency. Again, very roughly. This expedition discovered Alaska to the Europeans, as well as the Aleutian Islands, 4 more island groups, and heavily mapped out the eastern Siberian and Kuril Islands. However, the inability for Bering to travel above the northeastern tip of Siberia did crush any dreams of an Atlantic-Pacific route, much to the dismay of Tsar Peter. Bering himself, work completed, did not get to enjoy any reprieve. After leaving the Alaskan coast in 1742, his ships were grounded in a storm and torn to pieces. The crew managed to winter over on an island, but there, Bering fell ill and died, buried during his greatest discovery. The survivors of his crew managed to return a year later, bringing back with them high-quality otter pelts, something that interested many individuals indeed. From 1743 on, small groups of hunters would make the 3-year-long trek across Siberia and sometimes over into Alaska. Many of them would settle instead somewhere along the trek, staying in little outposts that they made along the way. It wouldn't be until 1774 that the first permanent settlement was created in Alaska, that of Unalaska. Seriously, that is its name. The Russians traded with the native Aleut people on the island since the mid-1750s. Conflict a few years later between the native population and Russian trappers led to a trading post and later permanent settlement being established. Many of the trappers enslaved the native population and had them do the hunting instead, taking hostages or family members to force them to hunt. As the riches of the pelts became widely spread, competition between various Russian companies occurred, and mass enslavement of the Aleut population followed. With the accession of Catherine the Great in 1763, she called for peaceful relations with the Alaskan natives, and while some settlers were more than able to live in a peaceful cooperation, others continued the hostage and family splitting, leading to just a few companies controlling the entire operations within the colony. As the animal population declined, the natives were forced into worse and worse conditions to meet the demand of pelt quotas. This led to a number of violent skirmishes between the natives and the Russian colonizers. The natives did manage to secure a few victories, but these were met with heavy retaliation. Mass murder, villages being burned, equipment being destroyed or stolen, decimated the already weakened native population, as disease wiped out over 80% of the population by the start of the 19th century. The largest of these retaliations being the Awak Massacre in 1784. Grigory Shliapov, the man that essentially ran the whole Alaskan colony, ordered the massacre after the natives resisted the construction of a settlement on Sikalaki Island. Initial skirmishes had the natives retreat to Refuge Rock, where upwards of 3,000 were slaughtered. Since then, the island, even to modern day, lacks a permanent population. This act of brutality was too much for many native chiefs, who surrendered to the Russians thereafter. Nevertheless, native resistance was strong in some areas until 1804, when the last major battle took place, that being at the Battle of Sitka. Even with the natives largely quelled, the Russians never fully colonized Alaska, sticking instead to the coast and shunning the interior. But by this time, the downfall of the colony was inevitable. It was never really particularly profitable in the first place, and the fact that supply ships from the home country only arrived every few years to drop off provisions made the colony extremely dependent on American and British food and material. This, both of whom were eventually able to cut into the already meager profits of the pelt trade. Even still, an Uske, or claim of sovereignty, was proclaimed in 1821, claiming all of Alaska and most of the Pacific Northwest as Russian territory, with all trading with foreign vessels prohibited. Only once was this claim of sovereignty actually enforced, when a Russian sloop captured an American merchant vessel, but after protests from Washington, the ship was released. The demand of no foreigners was quickly put to the wayside though, as once again, the colonists needed the materials desperately from the American populace, and they were running out of ways to pay. The British Hudson Bay Company was leased southern Alaska in 1839 in return for provisions and materials, while the Americans were given hunting rights for the same resources. By the 1860s, the Russian government was ready to abandon its American colony. Zealous overhunting had severely reduced the fur-bearing animal population. This, combined with the difficulties of supplying and protecting such a distant colony, as shown by the recent Crimean War, reduced interest in the territory. After the Union victory in the American Civil War, an offer was once again extended to the Americans for the purchase of Alaska. Secretary of State William H. Stewart viewed this as a golden opportunity to distract people from the tensions back at home, as many in the Congress were heavily debating the course for Reconstruction, and the Johnson administration had alienated many in their own party. The negotiations were completed after a long night, with the US purchasing Alaska for $7.2 million, or 2 cents an acre. Seward and many other Americans believed that Asia would become an important market for the country's products, and expected that Alaska would serve as a base for American trade with Asia, as well as heavily boost American power in the Pacific. Also, British Columbia now stood largely surrounded by American territory, and many were eyeing the land as something that the United States would take soon in the future. The Treaty of Purchase passed the United States Senate with 37 votes for and 2 against. Most newspapers and a fair number of the public were in support or at least neutral to the purchase. Some did consider it a folly or little more than an icebox, but others saw the potential value in the animal and lumber trade, with hunting still being the mainstay of the Alaskan economic output, until the Klondike Gold Rush in 1896, in which over 100,000 people traveled to the so-called icebox in search of fortune. But that is where the story of the Russian colony ends, an enterprise that was ruled brutally and violently, all in the name of profit.